I'm Grace Whitaker, 31, and the first thing I saw when I walked into my apartment was a white envelope sitting dead center on the coffee table like it had been waiting for breath. 3 years and not a single call from my father. Then, my name written in neat loops that tugged at old Sunday mornings. I stood there with my coat half off, heart thudding, trying to decide if opening it would fix something or break what little was left. The city hummed beyond the windows, but all I could hear was the hush that comes after a slammed door. I reached for the envelope, felt the weight of good paper, and the ache of unfinished sentences pressed behind my ribs. My thumb slid under the flap, and the room seemed to tighten around me. That's when my grandfather Harrison stepped from the kitchen doorway, his voice steady and low. "Hold on, kiddo, before you rush, take one more look." Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground when family expected something else. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where kindness was taught before arithmetic, where neighbors waved from porches, and my father believed a good name was worth more than any dollar. He ran a woodworking shop that smelled like cedar and lemon oil, and he raised me on careful promises: show up on time, tell the truth, leave things better than you found them. My mother's parents lived a different life. Harrison had climbed from nothing to everything, and when he visited, sleek black cars lined our street beside pickup trucks, the contrast as sharp as his suits. He respected hard work the way my father did, but he didn't treat ambition like a threat. And he looked at my ideas the way a builder studies a blueprint, seeing rooms that could exist if somebody was brave enough to pour a foundation. By my late 20s, the little app I'd been tinkering with in spare hours was earning real contracts, the kind that made me choose between the shop and a startup that suddenly needed all of me. I tried to explain that I wasn't abandoning what my father taught me. I was applying it in a different place, making something sturdy out of code instead of wood. He heard it as rejection, a clean break from his name, and the argument that followed hung heavy with words we couldn't take back. 3 years passed like winter that refused to thaw. Holidays slipped by, voicemails stayed unsent, and I learned how to live with the outline of a person who wasn't there. Harrison never pushed me to pick sides, but he didn't let me forget I had choices. He invested in my company with the same clear eyes he used on balance sheets, then showed up for dinner with takeout and stories that filled the quiet. His world ran on fast decisions and long memories, yet he still asked about the shop, about the community center where my father volunteered, about whether I missed the sound of sandpaper smoothing out mistakes. I did often, and I missed the man who taught me to measure twice before I cut anything important, including my own future. Pride can be a careful inheritance, though, and neither of us knew how to spend it without losing our footing. That's why the envelope felt like a door unlatching in an old house, familiar hinges creaking. I could see the P.O. box he had used for years. The town named the stamp place just so details that made me think maybe he had been trying to reach me and finally found the nerve. The living room light turned the page a soft gold, and I imagined the first line he might have written, the apology neither of us knew how to start. Harrison came closer, his expression thoughtful, then tapped the corner of the envelope like he was testing a joint for hairline cracks. "If this is what you've been waiting for," he said, "it can survive one more minute." I looked down, and for the first time noticed something that didn't quite match the man who taught me to leave a good, honest mark. Something small but sharp enough to catch. Harrison's words slowed everything around me. I studied the envelope again, really looked this time, tracing the careful loops of my name and the flawless slant of the handwriting. My father had a way of pressing too hard with his pen. His letters always left faint grooves on the next sheet. These lines were smooth, too smooth, like someone copying an image from memory. The paper itself felt wrong, too expensive and new, not the kind of stationery he used to keep in his desk drawer back home. A cold unease crept into my chest, as if the air itself had thickened. "Something's off," Harrison murmured, taking the envelope from my hands. He turned it over under the lamplight, his sharp eyes following each corner, each crease. The stamp was generic, mass-printed. Your dad always used commemorative ones, landscapes, old trains. It's small, but that's not him. His voice had dropped into the low, steady tone I'd heard him use in boardrooms when something wasn't adding up. and the slant he added tapping the address Daniel's right hand never healed properly after that fall off the ladder. His writing's been tilted ever since. This one's straight as a ruler. I wanted to argue, to tell him maybe my father had learned to write differently, but deep down I knew better. The rhythm of the handwriting was too careful, like it had been traced more than written. My heart, which only minutes ago had fluttered with a shy hope, now sank heavy and slow. I tried to smile to shake it off, but my fingers trembled when I reached to take the letter back. The faint smell of fresh ink clung to it, crisp and unfamiliar. Harrison met my eyes, his expression unreadable. "You sure you want to open that?" he asked quietly. "You can't unsee what's inside." I tore the flap before I could second-guess myself. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The words were typed cold, even lines on a clean page. There was no, "My dear Grace," no, "I've missed you." Just a stark plea, "I'm in trouble and I need your help." My eyes moved quickly down the page. He, or whoever had written this, claimed his accounts were frozen, and he needed $50,000 wired immediately to prevent a financial disaster. There was an account number, a warning not to call, and a signature at the bottom that read, "Your loving father, Daniel." The room tilted. Harrison didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The air between us filled with the truth neither of us wanted. This wasn't my father's voice. My father could be proud, stubborn, impossible, but he was never cold. This sounded like a stranger dressing in his clothes. My throat tightened as I set the letter on the table. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was suddenly too loud. Harrison picked up the page, read it once, then exhaled through his nose. "A scam," he said simply. "A very personal one." The word landed like a blow. Scam. It seemed impossible that someone would take the time to mimic my father's handwriting, to choose words that stabbed at the softest part of me. My stomach twisted as realization settled in. Someone had studied us. Someone knew about the years we hadn't spoken, about the pride and silence that had grown between us like a wall. I rubbed my arms to chase away the chill, but it wasn't the cold air that had me shivering. "Who would do this?" I asked quietly. Harrison set the letter down and straightened his face, shifting from gentle concern to something sharper. "Someone close," he said. "Someone who knows what happened." He took out his phone thumb, moving fast across the screen. "I've got a contact at the precinct. We can have this traced before it goes any further." I shook my head before he could finish. "No, not yet. If we make it official too soon, it'll blow up before we even understand it. Let's find out who's behind it first." The moment Harrison said the handwriting was wrong, I felt the air shift. I brought the envelope closer, and the truth began to bleed through the illusion I'd been clinging to. The letters were too even, each stroke too clean, as if a machine had mimicked the warmth of a human hand. My father's writing had always leaned slightly to the right from a wrist he broke as a kid. This was flawless, practiced, almost clinical. The hope I had built in seconds started to collapse in on itself, silent and suffocating. Harrison stood beside me, his tone calm but unyielding. "It's an imitation, Grace," he said, turning the envelope between his fingers. "Whoever did this knew what they were copying." I stared at the page, my hands trembling as a knot of disbelief and humiliation tightened in my chest. The idea that someone had forged my father's voice made my stomach turn. "Then what's inside?" I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Harrison nodded toward the letter. "Let's find out." The paper slid out easily, light and crisp, as though it had never belonged to anything real. The words were typed formal, cold, and utterly detached. "Dearest Grace," it began, but there was no affection in the phrasing, no hint of the man who used to leave notes tucked into my lunchbox or scrawl reminders on the fridge in blue ink. The letter claimed my father was in financial trouble, begging for $50,000 to be wired immediately to a listed account. It even warned me not to call. I read it twice, my pulse thudding louder each time. The signature at the bottom. "Your loving father, Daniel," felt like a cruel punchline. Harrison took the letter, his expression unreadable, then placed it on the table between us. "This wasn't written by your father," he said. "It's bait." His voice held a steadiness that made the situation somehow more terrifying. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. Someone knew too much. They knew my father's handwriting, our estrangement, even how to phrase the guilt that had haunted me for years. This wasn't random, it was personal. I pressed my palms together, trying to quiet the tremor in my fingers. "So someone studied us," I said quietly. "They're using the silence between us to get what they want." Harrison's gaze softened for a moment before turning sharp again. "And that means they're close," he replied. He stepped away and made a quick call, his tone clipped and professional, the same voice that had negotiated billion-dollar deals. "I'll have someone at the precinct take a look," he said when he hung up. But I shook my head. "Not yet," I told him. "This is family, and if we turn it over too early, we may never find out who's behind it." He hesitated, the businessman in him, weighing the risk, but then he gave a slow nod. "All right, Grace. What do you have in mind?" I stared at the letter again, tracing the details that had once seemed like comfort. The P.O. box. The phrasing, it all pointed toward one person who would have known how to twist my father's life into something exploitable. "Lydia," I said finally. The name tasted bitter. My father's ex-wife had always despised me, treating me like an obstacle to the lifestyle she thought she deserved. She was elegant, practiced, and cold, with a talent for turning affection into leverage. I hadn't seen her since the divorce, but the thought of her still sent a chill down my spine. Harrison didn't seem surprised. "Your father's divorce finalized 6 months ago," he said quietly. "I kept tabs. She got a generous settlement, but she's been burning through it fast. That fit the picture perfectly." I opened my laptop and called my old college friend Evan, a cybersecurity expert who owed me a few favors. Within an hour, we were cross-referencing the bank account from the letter with crypto wallets tied to gambling sites and proxy servers. The trail was thin, but it existed. One of the wallets matched transactions traced to a high-end casino app registered under Lydia's maiden name. By the time the sun dipped behind the city skyline, we had enough circumstantial evidence to know she was desperate and reckless. Harrison's contacts confirmed that Lydia had been moving money between offshore accounts, always just enough to stay one step ahead of scrutiny. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the evidence glowing across my laptop screen, the forged handwriting, the carefully chosen words, the demand for secrecy. She had built a perfect trap using the one weapon she knew would work my father's absence. "She's betting you'll pay before you think," Harrison said. "She's banking on guilt." I nodded, a mix of anger and resolve rising in my chest. "Then she's underestimated us." I spent the next few hours planning, sketching out how to confront her without losing control of the narrative. Harrison listened occasionally, offering advice, his tone patient but precise. Every so often, I caught a flicker of something in his expression, a quiet pride that reminded me of when I was a child, learning to hammer my first nail straight. When the clock neared midnight, Evan texted back with another piece of the puzzle: Lydia's current address in the city, a rental loft known for short-term leases, paid in cash. She wasn't hiding well, just fast-moving. I turned my phone toward Harrison. "If we handle this right, I said we'll have her cornered before she even knows she's been found." Harrison folded his arms, considering the plan. "You sound like me when I was 40, he said, a trace of a smile touching his lips. "Except you're better at it." It was the first warmth of the evening, and for a moment it almost eased the heaviness that had been sitting in my chest. We had a name, a motive, and a trail, but the cost of finding the truth was something I could already feel, a reckoning waiting in my father's shadow. As I closed the laptop, the letter still sat on the table, its folded edges crisp and unbent. It no longer looked like a message from a lost parent. It looked like evidence, the kind detectives bag and tag under sterile light. I thought of the years between my father and me, how silence had built a bridge no one dared cross. Now someone had walked across it with counterfeit words, and I intended to find out how far they'd gone. I stood stretching stiff arms and glanced at Harrison. He was watching me the way he did when weighing risk and reward, but there was something gentler beneath it. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we make the first move." I nodded, though rest felt impossible. I knew this was only the beginning, the first ripple of a deeper storm. As I turned off the lights, the letter caught one last glint of reflection from the street below, shining like a warning. Somewhere out there, Lydia thought she was winning. She had no idea that by morning the silence she used to hide behind would finally start to speak back. By morning, the city felt different, quieter, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that letter again, those clean mechanical words signed with my father's name. The sky outside was a pale gray, and the light coming through the window reminded me of those early mornings in my father's workshop before everything had fallen apart. Harrison was already at the dining table, coffee in hand, reading from his tablet. He didn't look up until I joined him. "She's on the move," he said, sliding the screen toward me. It showed a series of transactions, small amounts timed, almost hourly. "Lydia's liquidating whatever's left. She'll need another source of cash soon." I nodded, the last of my hesitation slipping away. "Then it's time we stopped her before she finds one." We spent the next hour mapping everything we knew, dates, accounts, connections, the rhythm of her desperation. Evan joined our video call, his voice calm but alert. "She's been using a proxy network to mask her identity, but I think I can narrow down the IP to the city's west side," he said. "If she's using that cafe hotspot again, I can confirm within the day." I could hear the faint hum of traffic behind him, the sound of another morning beginning somewhere else. "Do it," I said. "The sooner we find her, the sooner we end this." Harrison leaned back, studying me. "You've got her cornered, Grace, but you'll need proof that connects her directly to your father's identity theft. Otherwise, it's just conjecture." His tone wasn't critical, only measured like a mentor reminding a student that precision mattered more than speed. I took a breath. "Then we build proof. She wants money, and I'm the source. If we let her think I've taken the bait, she'll make her move." Harrison set his cup down, his jaw tightening slightly. "That's dangerous," he said. "She's unpredictable when cornered." But when I met his eyes, he saw I wasn't asking for permission. After a moment, he gave a single nod. "All right, then we'll make sure she's the one walking into a trap." By mid-afternoon, I'd composed a text using the same number from the forged letter. My hands hovered above the phone before I sent it. "Dad, I got your message. I can't send the full amount yet, but maybe we can meet and talk about it in person." The response came quicker than I expected, just 2 words. "Tomorrow, noon." Then an address downtown. My stomach tightened. I didn't need to look it up. The name of the cafe was familiar. Lydia had once bragged about it, calling it our spot, when she and my father were still together. Harrison arranged to meet a contact from his security firm an hour before the meeting. I didn't ask for details. I trusted him to handle the logistics. What I needed was composure. I stood in front of my mirror that morning, steadying my breath as I buttoned a simple navy blouse. Nothing flashy, nothing that looked defensive. I told myself I was going to have a conversation, not a confrontation, but my pulse said otherwise. When I arrived at the cafe, the air smelled of roasted coffee beans and rain-soaked pavement. Harrison sat at a table across the room, half hidden behind a newspaper, his silver hair unmistakable even at a distance. I found a corner booth facing the door. Every sound seemed sharper: the scrape of a chair, the hiss of the espresso machine, the rhythm of my own breathing. Then, at exactly noon, she appeared. Lydia moved through the room like she still owned it. Her coat was tailored, her heels precise against the tile floor. When she spotted me, her expression softened into the same polished warmth she used to wear at family holidays. "Grace," she said with a rehearsed smile, sliding into the seat across from me. "It's been far too long." 3 years, I replied evenly. "And somehow, you're still using my father's name to pay your bills." Her smile faltered, the edges cracking before she caught herself. "I don't know what you mean. Daniel asked me to reach out. He didn't know how to contact you himself." I opened my bag, slowly pulling out the printed letter. "You mean this one? The one typed, not written, the one with a bank account that leads straight to one of your shell companies?" Her eyes darted to the paper and back to me. "You're mistaken." Her tone was light, but her hand tightened around her coffee cup. "Evan traced the wallet," I said, keeping my voice low. "Every transfer, every gambling payout. You've been bleeding my father dry for months, and now you've tried to pull me into it." Her face hardened, all pretense gone. "You think you're so clever," she hissed. "You walked away from your father when he needed you. You have no idea what he's become without me." I met her gaze unflinching. "No, Lydia. You made sure I didn't." I stood then, sliding the letter toward her. The police already have copies of everything. If you want to explain yourself, you can start there." Her chair scraped against the floor as she pushed back abruptly. For a split second, I thought she might try to storm out. Then the door opened, and 2 officers stepped inside. Harrison didn't move, but his eyes met mine across the room, calm and certain. "Lydia Barnes," one of the officers said as they approached. She froze. "You're under arrest for fraud and identity theft." The entire cafe seemed to fall silent. I watched as they read her rights, her voice breaking in protest. When they led her past me, she whispered, "You'll regret this, Grace." I didn't answer. The sound of the door closing behind her was louder than anything she said. When the police car pulled away, the noise of the cafe resumed, cautious at first, then normal. Harrison joined me at the table, folding the newspaper neatly before setting it aside. "You handled that well," he said. His tone was soft, but I could hear the fatigue beneath it. I nodded, suddenly aware of how tired I was. The adrenaline that had carried me through the morning was fading fast. "She won't touch your father again," he added. "Now the real work begins." I knew what he meant. Catching Lydia was only one layer of a much deeper wound. Somewhere my father was still living with the wreckage she'd left behind: his finances, his pride, his sense of judgment. And after 3 years of silence, it would fall to me to face him. Harrison reached for the letter, the same one that had started all of this. "It's strange," he said quietly. "A lie can be cruel enough to destroy people, but sometimes it forces truth out into the open." I didn't reply. Outside, the clouds were clearing, a thin beam of sunlight breaking across the wet sidewalk. I watched it for a long moment, feeling both relieved and heavy all at once. When we stepped outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the faint scent of spring rain. Harrison offered to drive, but I shook my head. "I need to go alone," I told him. He hesitated, then gave a small nod. "All right," he said. "You'll know what to say when you get there." I turned toward the car parked by the curb, the city traffic moving steadily around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what waited beyond the silence. Somewhere out there, my father was still holding on to a story that needed to end, and now I was finally ready to tell him the truth. I drove across town in silence, following streets I hadn't taken in years. The closer I got to my father's house, the heavier the air felt. The rain from earlier had dried, leaving the road damp and shining beneath the late afternoon sun. When I pulled into the driveway, the sight of the place almost stopped me. The shutters were still the same faded green, the rose bushes still trimmed neatly by the porch, but the life that once filled this house was gone. It looked smaller, somehow older. I sat there for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the front door. That same door had closed behind me the night I left after our argument, after the words that changed everything. I didn't know what waited behind it now. When I finally stepped out, my heart beat so loud it drowned out the hum of the passing cars. The bell sounded the same soft chime it always had. A few seconds later, the door opened just wide enough for me to see him. My father stood there, his face pale and thinner than I remembered. His hair had gone grayer at the temples, and the easy confidence he used to carry was gone. He looked surprised, almost frightened, as if I were a ghost. "Grace," he whispered, his voice catching. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed hard. "We need to talk, Dad." He started to close the door, his hand trembling on the knob. "If this is about the letter, I don't know what you've heard, but it wasn't you," I said quickly, my words sharper than I meant. "It was Lydia. She forged it. She's been arrested." The door stopped moving. For a few seconds he didn't say anything. Then his hand fell away from the knob, and his shoulders sank. The sound that came next wasn't words. It was the kind of exhale you hear when someone's held everything in for too long. "She took everything," he murmured, his voice breaking. He looked at me, then his eyes glistening. "Grace, she took the house, the business, the savings. Everything." I stepped forward before he could retreat, and for the first time in 3 years, I reached for him. He didn't resist. He just collapsed into my arms, shaking with quiet sobs that ripped through both of us. For so long, I had imagined this moment, sometimes with anger, sometimes with longing, but nothing prepared me for the weight of him trembling in my arms. We stood there like that for what felt like forever. When he finally pulled back, I saw the man who had taught me how to ride a bike, who once laughed louder than anyone else in a room. But now there was only exhaustion. "Come inside," he said softly. The living room was dim curtains half closed, the air carrying a faint scent of dust and old varnish. The walls were still lined with photos of us, me as a kid, holding a trophy him, grinning with sawdust on his shirt. But they looked more like artifacts than memories. He motioned for me to sit, then lowered himself into the chair across from me. When she left, he said I thought it was just another argument. But then I found the accounts emptied the shop in debt, the mortgage unpaid. I couldn't even tell Harrison. I was too ashamed. His voice cracked again. I thought I could fix it before anyone knew. I kept working, kept trying, but every month it got worse. When the divorce was final, she took what was left of my pride with her. I listened quietly, letting the words settle in the space between us. The silence wasn't the angry kind anymore. It was full of the things we hadn't said. His regret my distance the years that had eroded what once felt unbreakable. "She found my journal," he said suddenly. "The one with all the letters I wrote you but never sent. I didn't even realize it was gone until the police called. She must have copied the handwriting from those drafts. She knew exactly how to make it sound like me. The thought hit me harder than I expected. She used your words," I said softly. "She used what you couldn't say to me." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "She knew I wanted to make things right. She used that against both of us." The room went quiet again. I reached across the table and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, the same as when I was little. "It's over now," I said. "She can't hurt you anymore." He gave a small, weary smile. "Maybe not, but I can't get back the years I spent believing she cared." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Or the years I lost with you." My throat tightened. "We can't change what's gone, Dad, but we can start over." For the first time, his eyes met mine without flinching. "You'd still want that." "After everything, I never stopped wanting it," I said. He leaned back, his expression softening into something I hadn't seen in years. Relief. "I always thought I was protecting you," he said. "When you left the family business, I thought you were walking away from everything I built. I didn't see that you were building something of your own. I just wanted you to be proud of me," I whispered. "I always was," he said, his eyes glistening again. "I was just too stubborn to admit it." The words broke something open in me. For so long I'd carried the belief that I had failed him, that our silence was proof of how far apart we'd grown. Hearing him say those words made the weight I'd been holding finally lift. We talked for hours, filling in the empty years. He told me about the shop closing, about how he'd tried to find part-time work, how the neighbors offered to help, but he couldn't accept it. Pride had become a kind of armor he didn't know how to take off. And when the loneliness set in, Lydia had been there, charming, attentive, pretending to understand. When he described how easily she had twisted her way into his trust, I didn't hear weakness. I heard exhaustion. My father wasn't blind. He was broken in ways he didn't know how to repair. As the light outside faded into gold, the house didn't feel so hollow anymore. The air felt different, warmer, filled with something almost like peace. For the first time, the silence between us wasn't heavy, it was full. When I stood to leave, he followed me to the door. "Grace," he said, his voice quiet. "I know I can't undo what's been done, but I want to try. I want to be your father again." I smiled, a small, honest smile that reached my eyes. "Then start with one thing," I said. "Write me a letter, a real one." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I think I can do that." Outside, the sky was streaked with the last colors of sunset. As I walked toward my car, the air smelled faintly of sawdust and roses. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was coming home. I glanced back once before getting in. My father stood in the doorway, a faint smile on his face, watching until I drove away. The porch light flicked on behind him, a small, steady glow that followed me all the way down the street. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that letter would come, and when it did, it wouldn't ask for money or forgiveness. It would simply say what both of us had been trying to find the courage to say all along. The night after I visited my father, I couldn't sleep. His face stayed with me the way his eyes softened when he said he wanted to start over the small tremor in his hands as he promised to write. For years I had pictured him as the man who turned his back when I walked away, but now that image didn't fit. The man I saw last night was different, humbled, wounded, but still holding on to something deeper than pride. The next morning, sunlight spilled through my curtains, bright and insistent, as if it refused to let me hide from what came next. Harrison called early, checking in with his usual quiet concern. "How did it go?" he asked. His voice had that measured steadiness I'd come to rely on. "He knows everything now," I said. "About Lydia, about the letter. He's devastated, but he's still my dad." There was a long pause on the line. Then Harrison said, "That's all that matters, Grace. The rest we'll handle." He meant it too. His legal team had already moved forward, ensuring Lydia's accounts were frozen. She was facing a long road ahead, fraud, identity theft, and a list of charges that read like a ledger of deceit. But even knowing that justice was underway, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like recovery, slow and uneven. Later that week, I drove back to my father's house. This time, he met me at the door before I could knock. His hair was combed, and there was a faint smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. "Come in," he said, and there was something lighter in his tone. "I've been working on something." On the dining table sat a thick, leather-bound journal, the same kind he used to keep for his woodworking sketches. A pen rested across the open page. "It's not finished yet," he said, smiling awkwardly, "but I wanted you to see it." I stepped closer. The handwriting was his unmistakable leaning slightly to the right, pressed deeply into the paper. "My dearest Grace." The first line began. My throat tightened. I didn't read further. Instead, I closed the journal gently, pressing my palm against the cover. "You kept your promise," I said. He nodded. I thought it was time to put things in my own words again. His voice wavered, but he didn't look away. "I've spent years building things I could touch. Houses, furniture, a business. But the most important thing I ever built was right here." He touched his chest, then looked at me. And I nearly lost it. We sat down at the table, the steam from our mugs curling between us. He talked about the business, how it was gone, how he'd thought about selling what little equipment was left. But maybe he said it's not too late to start something new. Smaller, simpler. I smiled. "You always said a craftsman's worth isn't measured by the size of his shop." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You remembered that I remember everything I said." We spent the day sorting through the past in small, manageable pieces, old ledgers, family photos, tools that still smelled faintly of pine and polish. He showed me a carving he'd been working on a half-finished wooden box. The lid was plain, but the inside was lined with a strip of velvet. For the letters, he said quietly, all of them, the ones I wrote and the ones I still need to. By evening, the house didn't feel heavy anymore. The silence that had filled it for so long now felt like rest. My father walked me to the door as the sky turned to a soft rose color. "You think Harrison would ever forgive me?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated, then smiled. "He already has, Dad. He just needed you to find your way back first." He nodded slowly. "Tell him thank you for looking after you when I didn't." "I will," I said, though I knew Harrison didn't need thanks. He'd done it because that's what family did when love got lost. They waited for it to come home. When I got back to my apartment, a text from Harrison was waiting. "Dinner tomorrow. Just the three of us." I could picture him typing it curt, efficient, but with warmth hiding underneath. I sent back a simple yes. The next evening, I found myself sitting across from both of them at one of Harrison's favorite restaurants, a quiet place by the water, where the city lights reflected across the bay. The air between my father and grandfather was tentative, at first polite but careful. Harrison lifted his glass and said, "To second chances." My father raised his voice low, "and to lessons learned the hard way." There was a quiet toast, the kind that doesn't need many words. By dessert, the conversation had softened into laughter, small, easy stories about my childhood, the time I glued 2 pieces of wood together upside down, the summer we built a birdhouse that somehow became a squirrel feeder. As we walked out into the cool night air, Harrison turned to me. "You've done more good here than you realize," he said. "You didn't just stop a scam, Grace. You brought a family back from silence." I didn't answer. I just slipped my arm through his and looked up at the sky. Somewhere between the streetlights and the dark stretch of water, I thought about how something false, a forged letter, had led us all to something true. A week later, my father invited me back to the shop. The lights were on, the air filled with the familiar scent of sawdust and varnish. "I've started taking orders again," he said, pride creeping into his tone. "Small projects, custom pieces." A neighbor helped me spread the word. I ran my hand along one of the new pieces on the workbench, a beautifully simple wooden chair. "You haven't lost your touch," I said. He smiled. "Turns out muscle memory never leaves you. You just need the right reason to use it again." He walked over to the cabinet in the corner, the one that used to hold spare tools. When he opened it, I saw a single envelope resting on the shelf. My name was written on the front, the ink slightly uneven, but unmistakably his. "For when you're ready," he said. "It's not an apology. It's just everything I wish I'd said sooner." I nodded, unable to speak. I took the letter, holding it carefully, knowing it represented not just a message, but a beginning. Outside, the late spring air was cool against my face. The sun was sinking low, streaking the horizon with gold. I tucked the envelope into my coat pocket and turned back toward the shop. My father stood in the doorway watching me the way he used to when I left for school, hopeful, a little nervous, but proud. As I drove away, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting small pools of light on the road ahead. For the first time in years, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was peaceful. Somewhere behind me, the workshop lights were still on, and I knew he'd stay there a while, carving something new out of what was left. What began as a forgery had turned into something real, a restoration of trust, a bridge rebuilt from the ashes of misunderstanding. And though we still had a long way to go, I could finally see where it led. The following week, I sat across from my father in his small kitchen, the one that still smelled faintly of varnish and coffee. The letter he'd written me lay open on the table between us. His handwriting leaned just slightly to the right, each word pressed into the paper as if he wanted them to last. I'd already read it twice, but I couldn't bring myself to fold it away. It wasn't just an apology, it was proof that the silence was over. He watched me with a mix of worry and patience. "Too much?" he asked quietly. I wasn't sure how to start. I shook my head. "It's perfect," I said, and I meant it. Every line carried his voice, the one I'd missed for 3 years. He'd written about the mistakes, about how pride had built a wall between us, about how he wished he'd listened before speaking. But most of all, he'd written that love had never left. It had just gone quiet. The sound of a car pulling up outside caught our attention. A moment later, there was a knock on the door. My father stood glancing at me before opening it. Harrison stepped in a folder tucked under one arm, his coat still dusted with the light drizzle outside. "I thought I'd bring some updates," he said, setting the folder down on the counter. "Lydia's hearing is next week. She's taking a plea deal." My father's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Harrison looked between us, then added, "Her accounts are frozen. The restitution process will take time, but it's underway." I could see the weight in my father's shoulders. "I don't care about the money," he said finally. "I just want it to be done." Harrison nodded slowly. "It nearly is. But you should know her lawyer's asking for leniency, citing emotional distress." The words hung in the air for a moment. My father gave a faint, humorless laugh. "She's caused enough of that for a lifetime." Harrison rested a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to go to court. My team will handle the statement." But my father shook his head. "No, I'll go. Not to speak to her, just to be there." We all stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint patter of rain against the window. Then Harrison looked at me. "You'll go too." "Yes," I said. "She deserves to see that she didn't destroy us." The following Monday, the courthouse felt colder than I expected. The marble floors echoed with every footstep, the air sharp with that sterile mix of paper and polish. My father walked beside me, his back straighter than I'd seen in years. Harrison followed close behind his presence, steady, protective. When Lydia entered the courtroom, her confidence was gone. She looked smaller, dressed in muted gray, her eyes darting toward us before quickly turning away. The proceedings were brief. Her attorney recited a statement about addiction, poor choices, and regret. My father didn't move. His expression stayed calm, unreadable. When it was over, Lydia turned once more, her gaze searching for something in my father's face, pity maybe, or forgiveness. But there was nothing left for her to find. The silence that followed wasn't angry or bitter. It was final. Outside, the sky had cleared. The three of us walked down the courthouse steps together. Harrison exhaled deeply, pulling his coat tighter. "It's done," he said quietly. "Time to move forward." My father stopped beside the fountain at the edge of the square, watching the water glint in the afternoon sun. "I spent so many years thinking legacy meant holding on," he said. "But maybe it means knowing when to let go." He looked at me, then his voice softening. "I'm proud of you, Grace. You saved me before I even realized I needed saving." I didn't answer right away. The sunlight caught the lines in his face, deep but not defeated. He wasn't the same man who'd once clung to pride and tradition. He was someone new, someone who had learned the quiet strength of starting over. That night we had dinner at my apartment. Harrison insisted on bringing dessert from a bakery he'd loved for decades. The three of us sat at my small kitchen table, the same way families do after long storms, tired, content, and just a little more whole than before. As the evening wound down, my father took out his phone and showed me photos of the workshop. "The orders are coming in faster than I can keep up," he said, smiling. "A few of the old clients heard I was back in business." "That's good news," I said. "You deserve it." He paused, then added, "I'm hiring again. There's a young guy from the trade school, Eli Parker. Reminds me of myself, only he listens better." The hint of humor in his voice made Harrison chuckle. "Sounds like the shop's in good hands," I said. "It is," he replied. "But it's not just the shop, it's everything. I thought losing money was the worst thing that could happen. Turns out losing family hurts more. But I got both back in different ways." The words settled quietly between us. Harrison raised his glass, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "To healing," he said, "and to the Whitakers finding their way home." I looked at my father, who nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and peace I hadn't seen before. "To home," he said softly. The clink of the glasses was small but steady, the sound of something fragile being made whole again. Later, after they left, I stood by the window watching the lights of the city flicker like quiet promises. I thought of the letter in my purse, my father's handwriting etched into the page. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic ending. It was something far better, a truth reclaimed after years of silence. For the first time in a long while, the quiet around me didn't feel empty. It felt earned. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, I knew we'd already crossed the hardest part of it. What began with a forged letter, meant to divide us, had somehow brought us back together. The next morning, when I walked into my office, sunlight poured across my desk. A small box sat waiting, plain and unmarked. Inside was the wooden keepsake my father had finished, the one he'd been carving weeks ago. The lid opened easily, revealing a single folded note resting inside. For new beginnings, it read in his familiar script. I traced the words with my thumb, smiling to myself. Somewhere beyond the city's hum, I imagined him back at the shop's sawdust, floating through the air like tiny sparks of renewal. The silence between us had once been a wound. Now it was a bridge, and tomorrow I would cross it again. The next few months moved quietly like the soft rhythm of waves after a long storm. My father's shop was open again, and the hum of machinery filled his days instead of silence. Harrison checked in often, usually dropping by with coffee or a stack of legal papers for my father to sign, but sometimes just to talk. They were rebuilding something that had been missing for years, a kind of understanding that didn't need many words. One afternoon, I stopped by the workshop with lunch. The place smelled like cedar and varnish the way it used to when I was little. My father stood at his bench, bent over a half-finished frame. When he looked up and saw me, his face broke into that quiet smile I'd almost forgotten. "You're just in time," he said. "I could use a second opinion." He handed me a small wooden box, the lid smooth under my fingertips. Inside, nestled on a piece of velvet, was a folded letter, his handwriting again the familiar lean to the right. "Another one," I teased gently. He nodded, a trace of color rising in his cheeks. "It's for you. For later. Not because of guilt this time, just because it feels good to write." I smiled and set the box down carefully. "You've come a long way, Dad. So have you," he said, his voice soft but sure. "You didn't give up on me when it would have been easier to walk away. You taught me something I should have known all along. Family isn't about control. It's about grace." He paused, eyes glinting with meaning. "And maybe that name of yours was never a coincidence." Outside sunlight streamed through the open door, lighting the sawdust swirling in the air. It looked almost golden. For the first time, this place didn't feel haunted by old expectations. It felt alive again. That evening, I drove with him to Harrison's estate for dinner. The house was warm, the smell of roasted herbs filling the air. Harrison greeted us both with that rare smile that always carried pride beneath restraint. "You two look like you finally exhaled," he said, leading us inside. During dinner, the conversation drifted easily from stories about my father's new apprentice to Harrison's old business lessons that somehow turned into jokes. There was no tension, no shadow of what had come before, just three people who had finally found a way back to one another. When dessert came, Harrison raised his glass. To rebuilding, he said simply. My father and I exchanged a glance and lifted ours too. It wasn't a grand toast, but it didn't need to be. The room felt full, grounded by forgiveness and quiet gratitude. After dinner, I stepped out onto the terrace. The air was cool, the kind that carried the faint scent of rain. My father joined me a moment later, standing beside me in silence. "You know," he said, "when I lost everything, I thought I'd never deserve a second chance. But maybe life doesn't hand them out. You earn them one honest day at a time." I nodded, the truth of it settling deep. That's all any of us can do. He turned toward me, his eyes reflecting the lights from the garden below. "Whatever happens next, I just want you to know you were right to choose your own path. I see that now." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The night was still broken only by the faint hum of crickets. Then he said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Grace." The words landed softly, steady and real. They were the ones I'd waited 3 years to hear, and somehow hearing them now felt like the right time. Later, as I drove home under a stretch of clear sky, I thought about how far we'd come. The silence that once divided us had turned into space for understanding. The anger, the regret, the pain, they hadn't vanished, but they'd changed shape. They'd become something we could learn from. Lydia's name came up less and less. Her trial ended quietly, and justice had taken its course. But the true victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was here in the quiet peace of a family that had refused to stay broken. Weeks later, a small package arrived in the mail. Inside was a journal hand-bound in leather with my father's handwriting across the first page. For Grace it read, "In case I forget to say things out loud." Each page was filled with memories, reflections, and bits of advice lessons from his life written without pride or apology, just sincerity. I closed the cover and held it to my chest. Somehow what began as a forged letter, meant to deceive us, had led to this, a real one born from truth. It was a reminder that sometimes the worst moments uncover the best in us if we're brave enough to face them. The past would always be part of our story, but it no longer defined us. We had learned that love isn't weakened by distance or silence, it's tested by it, and when it survives, it comes back stronger. As I sat by the window that evening, watching the sky fade into twilight, I thought of my father's words. Family isn't about control, it's about grace. He was right. It's about patience, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to start again, and that's what we did. If you've ever rebuilt something you thought was lost, whether it was trust, love, or family, then you know the beauty in beginning again. Don't rush the silence. Sometimes it's where the truth finally takes root. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that second chances are still possible and that it's never too late to write a new ending.